Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, and today we're going to be talking about game genres. Now, there's something I have to make very clear before we continue. This can be an extremely contentious topic. There are people out there who hold firm to their beliefs of how certain genres should be applied, and I'm not here to dismiss those people, rather to demystify some of the things which go into properly defining the genre of a game. It's true that there are tons of games out there which are officially labeled as one kind of genre when they are in fact some other kind. This is either done because of marketing pressure to try and make a game more appealing, or sometimes the developer or publisher simply don't know any better. The other thing too is that genres have evolved as the tech has gotten better and the styles of games have changed, so the way a genre is interpreted nowadays may actually be slightly different than long ago. Really, the important thing with genres is simply to give players a rough idea of what to expect before the player knows anything more about the game beyond simply its title. With that said, we're going to go over a fairly large number of common and a few not so common genres today. And you're going to see clips in the background of the games I've been known to play which belong to those genres, and at the end, I'm going to tell you guys what my favorite genres of games tend to be. So without further ado, let's get started. Perhaps the most basic genre of them all is the action genre, as it can be applied to countless games out there. However, you would typically use it on its own to describe a game where the goal is simply to beat levels with real-time control over your character. It's also routinely crossed with other genres to help indicate that the genre in question has a real-time component to its core mechanics where it otherwise wouldn't, or is also crossed with some genres to indicate a combat aspect which would otherwise not be there. I'll go more in depth into action crosses with each genre coming up. And here's one that's somewhat difficult to properly apply, as even back in the 80s people were getting this one wrong. Essentially, the arcade genre can be applied to any game where the main goal isn't to beat the game, but to achieve the highest score possible, since the game will either go on forever or loop back to its first level, depending on how long you can go without losing all of your lives. You can cross the arcade genre with many other genres too, however, when you use the arcade genre on its own, it's assumed you mean an action/arcade game, as that's what the vast majority of actual arcade machines contained. The adventure genre can be a bit confusing, considering it tends to mean two different things depending on if you're talking about console gaming or PC gaming, often resulting in mixing this genre up with RPGs or role-playing games. To put it simply though, an adventure game is one where your progression through the game is linked directly with the items you find and/or an inventory, not numerical stats like in an RPG. On consoles, this typically meant a game where you would find items which permanently gave you new abilities to be able to explore new areas, such as the Metroid and Zelda series. Whereas on the PC, this often meant games where you kept an inventory of items and had to use specific items in specific spots to see more of the story, such as the King's Quest and Quest for Glory series. Many adventure games tend to have action components, but you typically don't call a game an action/adventure unless most of the action is combat. That's why a lot of console adventures are actually action-adventure games. Now, traditionally, outside of video games, a role-playing game is one where you create your own avatar to thrust into a story, carving your own path through the game world as you go forwards. When this form of gameplay was first translated into video game form, it actually still worked this way, but it didn't take long for RPGs to start having you control predefined characters, which is where the confusion begins with the adventure genre. In short, you can tell the two apart because in an RPG, your progression is primarily linked to numerical stats, which you improve through encounters, either predetermined or random, and while you certainly have an inventory, and items in your inventory will likely be used to progress the story, if your numbers are bad, you're not getting much further. Unfortunately, many developers started to abuse this particular classification and started slapping RPG onto pretty much any game with even just tiny role-playing elements when the bulk of the game was something else entirely, like a first-person shooter. Make no mistake, action/RPG is a cross-genre and is typically applied to any RPG where the combat is done through direct, real-time control of your player, such as in the Elder Scrolls games. There's also a subgenre of RPG known as JRPG, used to refer to a particular style of RPG which was made popular in Japan, and is the format used in many of the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games. There's also another subgenre of RPG known as the dungeon crawl. This subgenre of RPG is special in that while it plays like an RPG, your progression is actually dependent almost entirely on random factors, including what weapons and armor are made available to you, as well as the areas and dungeons themselves which you travel through. Most dungeon crawls are move-based, in that the action around the player only ticks every time the player makes a move. However, there are real-time dungeon crawls, referred to in just that way, such as the Diablo and Torchlight games, which are also technically a subgenre of action RPGs. It's kinda easy to see how that can get confusing. A puzzle game is any game where the core mechanic is to solve puzzles of virtually any type. And I say it like that because indeed, many games have puzzle elements, but are not considered puzzle games because those elements do not make up the core mechanics of the gameplay. There's also a special cross known as action/puzzle games, which indicate a puzzle-based game with an active mechanic beyond simply a timer, whereby the solution may change or may become impossible if you do not act, with the most basic example of an action puzzle game being Tetris. Some games, however, fall into an unusual category in that they play like an action puzzle game, yet don't have an active component. Most such games do have a core versus component though, so it's apt to call these games versus puzzle games, with a good example being the Puzzle Quest series. A platformer is a subgenre of the action genre, where the game typically plays from a side-scrolling view, with gravity pulling the player towards the bottom of the screen. Platforms, holes, and other obstacles are then placed in a variety of ways, and the challenge isn't necessarily in defeating the enemies, but in being able to navigate the level using whatever skills, tools, and power-ups the game provides. Platformers were very popular on game consoles, not so much in arcades or on home computers. There's many side-scrolling games with platforming sections which are not called platformers though, so it's important to remember that to be a platformer, the game's platforming has to be the central challenge towards progressing through the game. While most platformers are action games, there are what's referred to as puzzle platformers, where you solve puzzles in platforming environments, as well as cinematic platformers, which have frequent checkpoints and require you to survive very specific platforming challenges to progress cinematically through a story being unfolded before you. A shooter is a subgenre of the action genre, where your primary method of progression is to shoot stuff. Once 3D was thrown into the mix, it was often a good idea to define how the shooting took place, resulting in subgenres of 2D shooter, also known as the shmup, first-person shooter, and third-person shooter. If, however, you're mixing shooting with platforming, a more euphemistic way of referring to such games is to call them a run-and-gun platformer. There's also an extra subgenre of the 2D shooter known as the bullet hell shooter, where the screen is often completely filled with bullets to dodge, often moving in mesmerizing patterns. But to aid in dodging everything, the collision box used for the player is extremely tiny, often no bigger than 2x2 pixels. This is probably a good time to mention that first person and third person can be applied to any games genre when there's a 3D perspective involved and control of the character in 3 dimensions. This is important for a couple reasons. Firstly, there's many genres which aren't often shown in this manner, so being able to call something like System Shock a first-person adventure is essential. Another important reason, though, is that you can still use 3-dimensional graphics while limiting movement to a 2D plane, often erroneously called 2.5D when, quite frankly, they're still technically 2D games since you have no 3D control. The term 2.5D is supposed to be used to describe a 3D game where the levels you move around in with 3-dimensional control are built out of a 2-dimensional map, which is what was done by early first-person shooters such as Doom and Duke Nukem 3D. I guess it could be used the other way around too, but then you have to call games like Gradius 5 and Ikaruga 2.5D shooters, and that just feels wrong. A simulation game is essentially one where the core mechanic is in engaging the player in how something works and encouraging them to experiment with those mechanics to find ways to succeed. Though not necessarily how to win, as many simulation games don't have endings, such as the SimCity games. You can also cross the simulation genre with others, such as the action genre for games like the MechWarrior series, where the primary goal is combat, but you have other mechanics to micromanage as you go along. There's also a special subgenre of simulation known as the war simulation, where you're in control of a war machine of some sort, such as tanks, submarines, or fighter jets. A A fighting game is one where the core mechanic is to fight opponents, often one-on-one, in close quarters combat with a variety of punches, kicks, special moves, or whatever else seems appropriate given the setting. The most classic fighting games out there often took the form of boxing, wrestling, and martial arts. However, nowadays, when using the term fighting alone to describe a game genre, you usually mean a martial arts type game with no link to any professional sports. Whereas any fighting game with a professional sports link should be called a sports game crossed with the type of sport it is. A sports game is one which simulates a particular kind of real-life sport. Does everything from basketball to tennis to fishing or heck even hunting is considered a sports game. Often you'll want to cross the sports genre with whatever sport is being played in the game, such as a sports/football or sports/golf, as the names of these games frequently don't say what sport is actually being played, and you'd only know from the name if you had an interest in that sport. The nature of real sports has led sports video games to be some of the most rejected and forgotten about in all of gaming, as new revisions are often released for every year of a sport to include new players and updated stats. And you can usually find countless copies of the older versions in bargain bins for practically nothing as people throw them away. Beat-em-ups are a subgenre of fighting games where the core mechanic is to beat up enemies in close quarters combat with a variety of moves as you progress through a level. At their core, they're almost identical to fighting games, except you actually progress through levels and defeat multiple enemies along the way. In fact, there was never a good distinction between these types of games and fighting games early on, and it wouldn't be until the early 90s when the two slowly started to become more distinct in their branding, with early evidence of this happening being Capcom changing the name of an upcoming game called Street Fighter 89 to Final Fight, given feedback that the game didn't play anything like their original Street Fighter game. Although technically a sports genre, racing is often given its own genre category, so I'm treating it as such for this video. Racing games have a simple goal: race through a course and cross the finish line before anyone else. While racing games can be traditional, featuring real-life cars, they can be entirely fictional too, or in some cases can even involve weapons, with such games sometimes being referred to as racing/shooter games, but are more commonly called combat racing games. Either way though, sometimes it can be tricky to find out if a racing game has weapons or not without first seeing screenshots or videos, as the combat element may simply be glanced over and simply not emphasized. Strategy games are simply games where you have exclusively direct or exclusively indirect control over multiple units, and must guide them towards a final objective. This description can not only be applied to classic strategy games like chess and backgammon, but can be applied to modern games too, like Endless Space or the Command & Conquer series. Actually, C&C is a special subgenre of strategy known as the RTS, or real-time strategy, i.e. a strategy game with a real-time component. There's another somewhat more recent subgenre of strategy as well, known as tower defense. This subgenre of the strategy genre is intriguing because it plays so vastly different from typical strategy games. The core mechanic of a tower defense game is not in how you move your units, but how you place your units, with units often taking the form of towers, which serve as a stationary point from which attacks are automatically fired at advancing waves of enemies. Many such games allow you to create mazes out of your towers to help adjust the path the enemies must take to reach their goal, and in most tower defense games, the enemies never attack your towers, and are simply single-mindedly fixated on whatever goal it is you're protecting. The last genre I'm going to quickly discuss is the MMORPG. This is a special kind of RPG typically played in a social environment on public servers hosting hundreds or thousands of players all at once within the same game world. Now, unlike most games, MMOs often evolve over time with multiple expansions in order to keep the player base alive and well, not to mention paying monthly fees to actually be on the servers in the first place. When all is said and done though, they're more about window dressing the social nature of interacting online with weapons, stories, loot, and if you ignore those social aspects of these games or are uncomfortable with them, they just become mindless grindfests. That said, most MMOs are actually extremely complex with tons of content and are some of the most difficult games for developers to produce, let alone maintain following a release. And they have to be given how long players are expected to be involved with them for. So, this list is by no means complete or perfect, and I'm sure some of you will disagree on some of these points on how these genres are classified. But as I said, the nature of genres is constantly evolving, and I often witness these genres being applied incorrectly, so I felt having a video which addresses all of this would be a good idea. But now, the moment you've all been waiting for. What are my favorite genres? Well, let's do my top 5. Starting at number 5 are RPGs. Yes, RPGs are only number 5 on my list, but at least they made my top 5. I'm actually very picky when it comes to RPGs, and there's many out there I simply don't like despite being extremely well made and playable. The thing is, I play RPGs for the story first, so if I can't get vested into an RPG story, I just lose interest. My most favorite RPG is Final Fantasy IV, with other notable favorites including most of the Elder Scrolls series, Final Fantasies 6, 8, and 10, Robotrek, and more recently, the Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth series. At number 4 are shooters. All shooters. First-person shooters, 2D shooters, any of them. Actually, this is a bit odd in that there's not a whole lot of these games out there which I like, but the ones I do like, I really enjoy playing. Such as Doom, Duke Nukem 3D, Quake, the Descent series. This is for the first-person stuff. As with 2D shooters, I enjoy Tyrion 2000, the Raiden series, the Gradius series, and the Guardian Legend, which is technically a 2D shooter/adventure game. More recently, I picked up Ziggurat, which is actually a cross between a first-person shooter and a dungeon crawl. I should also point out that both System Shock and System Shock 2 are a couple of my most favorite computer games of all time, though I qualify them more as first-person adventures since a large portion of those games are exploration and finding items. At number 3 is racing. To put it simply, I just enjoy being able to play a game where the only concern is simply how well I'm playing. Just like with everything so far, I tend to be pretty picky about these and prefer racing games with epic music, weapons, and futuristic aspects. I don't actually have a most favorite racing game, but I really enjoy games from the F-Zero series, the Wipeout series, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, and more recently, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transform. At number 2 is, believe it or not, action/puzzle. No, not straight up puzzle games, but action puzzle games, or even versus puzzle games. The funny thing is, I'm not really too interested in playing these games, but they're high on my list of favorites because I tend to be extraordinarily good at them, with some of my favorites including classics like Tetris and Dr. Mario, but there's a lot of modern ones I enjoy as well, including Puzzle Quest Galactrix, It'll Do, 10 Million, and the Portal games. I'd also be remiss if I failed to mention my most favorite action puzzle game of all, Pokemon Puzzle League, which is one of only a tiny handful of games that I've mastered. Something I really want to demonstrate someday, but I need to do it on my real N64, which is currently stored away and inaccessible. I simply can't produce the same level of skill that I have emulated due to controller differences. And my number 1 most favorite genre is action/adventure. No, not straight up adventure games. Those are actually pretty low on my list as I tend to get frustrated with them. But action adventures, it's virtually impossible for me to not like these, regardless of content. And I have quite a number of both classics and modern games of this sort, including almost every Metroid game, several Zelda games, the Wonder Boy/Monster World games, or a couple modern ones being Super Panda Adventures and Muramasa the Demon Blade. Metroid happens to be my most favorite game of the series of all time, as I find many games in the series to be a perfect blend of exploration, action, progression, and innovation given when these games were released. As for my worst genres, I'm absolutely terrible at strategy games, excepting anything tower defense or anything made by Bullfrog Productions. But below that even, at the absolute bottom of my list, are MMORPGs. I simply can't stand playing them, even the good ones. Though I completely understand why people enjoy those games, they're just not for me. Anywho, this was a much longer filler than I expected, but hopefully if it gets any point across at all, it's that fitting games into a singular genre is almost impossible nowadays. Heck, sometimes just a single cross can be a tricky match, but we have genres to help define what to expect from a game before even knowing what it's about. So it's useful to understand how to properly define them, even when some or most of the internet is trying to tell you that you're wrong. In any case, Hope you all enjoyed this filler video, and as for the next episode of Ancient DOS Games, episode 186, going up on Saturday, May 7th, we're going to be taking a look at an adventure game where you can actually put your character into different stances. Now, if you think you know of a game like that, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and make sure to come back in May to enjoy more DOS gaming goodness and a month of nothing but adventure titles.